Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this 9 a.m. Very rainy morning. At least it's rainy here where I am in Cambridge. I don't know where y'all are here from. Um, I remember having a lot of fun at BostonFIG when I came pre-pandemic, and I'm super excited to be able to be back here in some sort of form. um, and yeah, I am here to talk to all of you, or talk with all of you really, about death and games. I've spent this last semester teaching a class on it at my college, which I'll get to in a second, and had some thoughts, wanted to talk to you about your thoughts, and just spend an hour thinking about really intense stuff and how they manifest in certain game mechanics, especially TTRPGs. Yeah, okay. So first of all, quick content warning. I'm not going to get super deep into any of this stuff, but obviously, as from the title, we're going to be talking about death and violence and some of the gory ways in which they manifest, although again, not too bad. But if that is something that you'd rather not talk about, then yeah, this is maybe not the talk for you, or maybe not at this moment. And since I do now have eyes on the chat, please feel free to shout out if you in the chat or in the Q&A spot, if you have things that you want to say, have thoughts, want me to stop, whatever. Okay, so here's me. Hello. Can someone just confirm for me that the text that's about this size is visible for you? Can you see that well enough? Can you read that kind of thing? Thanks, Ezra. Awesome. Okay. Please let me know if it's not. Okay. Hi, I'm Melissa. I currently am a video gaming studies assistant professor at Curry College, which is a small liberal arts school half an hour south of Boston. I got my PhD a couple years ago, and I have a book called Wandering Games that is coming out from MIT next year that I'm going to spend the beginning of my talk talking about. Because it sort of leads into my interest in death and games that I'm now working on more heavily. I'm also the co-editor of the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds. So if anything in that realm is, if you have questions about, anything about academic game studies or game publishing or any of that kind of stuff, super happy to talk about any of that. I started coming to this topic through walking sims. So I'm really into walking sims, and that's what my book is about. But I wasn't just interested in walking sims as such. I wanted to think about how walking inflects games across a whole variety of genres. So these are the main games that I talk about in my book, basically a chapter or so on each of these games. And as you'll see, none of them are really what are conventionally understood as walking sims. But rather wandering as a concept, as a theme, inflects all of them in these different ways. Most of which I'm not really going to get into because this is not a talk on wandering games. But the part of it that I do really want to talk about is the fact that walking sims, as a genre, have this reputation for being non-violent. Right? They have this reputation, they have this actually insulting connotation to them as originally conceived. They were supposedly this type of game that, they don't have guns, you can't die. And that was actually figured really negatively when the term first originated, 2012, 2013, that kind of era. However, if you actually take a look at any walking sims, they're definitely about death. Despite their super nonviolent reputation. So I will not spoil all of these classic walking sims, but just starting from top left, going clockwise, Gone Home, certainly a haunted house sort of feeling. Death is kind of pervading the whole story. You don't know exactly why or how, but it's there. Dear Esther, a storyline about a man who suffered tragedy in his past and is trying to come to terms with it. Firewatch, similarly. What Remains of Edith Finch down there on the bottom right, again with the haunted house mechanic, again with a whole house full of people who are mysteriously gone and or dead, and the player doesn't really know what might have happened to them. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture is in the center. Another world that is empty of people but filled with ghosts. And then The Path, which was one of the earliest walking sims, actually before the term existed, from Tale of Tales in 2008, where you take avatars of Little Red Riding Hood to grandmother's house, and they are both told not to leave the path, but then must leave the path and are then killed by respective wolves somewhere in the woods. Just looking in the chat. To your point, Ellen, Death Stranding, Dear Esther. Oh, you're pointing out what the games are? Yeah. Yeah, so there's this tension in walking sims as a genre that on the one hand, they have this undying PC, typically, where there is no threat of death to your character itself. But in a lot of walking simulators, the game world and the game narrative tend to revolve really heavily around death. Often the world is post-apocalyptic or haunted or both. So as I was like working on this book and thinking about walking, like all the valences of walking, I started thinking about how it's really that these games are about the aftermath of death. It's really a temporal thing. In most games, you, the player, are the bringer of death. You enter a peaceful scene, you kill everything in it, or you kill a lot of things in it. In a walking simulator, it's kind of the reverse. You enter a place where death has occurred or might have occurred, and you try to make sense of it. There is a gendered component to this, that, walking sims are often gendered as a feminized form of video games, or they have this feminine valence to them. And so maybe this is about, hey, Unparalleled Dove. So maybe this is about this difference between, being the bringer of death and doing the work of killing, rather than on the other side, the work of mourning, shrouding, that kind of thing. So there's this tension. And because I was writing a book about wandering games, and because my background is in literature, I was thinking about digression a lot too, and how in just literary studies in general, digression as a literary device is always about running away from death, or it is really often about running away from death. Digression is this metaphorical way for characters to treat death. Yay, chatting. So famously, we've got Scheherazade, who is threatened with death. She marries Emperor Shahryar, who says, "I'm going to kill you in the morning." And indeed, he has already killed many, many of his wives. He marries them at night and then kills them in the morning, so as to prevent himself from being cuckolded. And Scheherazade marries him, and then tells a story, and she always ends on a cliffhanger. So her ability to be digressive is actually putting death off, at least as long as she manages to keep being so digressive. So this then becomes a huge theme in literary digression through the centuries. And so we see it in games a ton. In games, this phenomenon is huge. The player character is often involved in some kind of digressing from quest to side quest, task to task. They're kind of trying and failing to stay alive, and do as many different activities as they can, because the more that they can do, the more that they can avoid dying. And in the midst of all of these little small deaths that are going on, there's this metafictional one where eventually the game is over. Eventually the book is over. And on the last page of a book or the last scene of a game, there's this sense where the entire world is going to end. And so by digressing further and further and further, you could maybe manage to stave off that like metafictional death of like the whole work. This threat does lessen in a lot of contemporary open world games, where even after you finish playing the narrative end of the story, you can keep roaming the world forever. I talk about this a bunch in a chapter that I do on Death Stranding and The Last of Us. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't have that post-death roaming component to it, but Death Stranding definitely does. And in a lot of ways, the game doesn't even start getting good until you finish the narrative component of the game, and then you just like wander around this landscape infrastructurally fixing things. And I, for one, certainly found that part of the game a lot more engaging than the actual narrative arc of it. So in this last chapter of the book, I started thinking about what it is to be playing Afterlife. Death Stranding and The Last of Us Part 2 are the only non-indie games that I actually consider. But I find them kind of almost more interesting for that, because they have to do their weird experimental thing a little more secretly. And they can't just sort of come out and say it. But both of these games have this post-death player character in a post-death world. There's something about their bodies that makes them unable to die. And then there's something about the world that has fundamentally shifted because certain characters are narratively unable to die. And then we have all of these game mechanics that spring up to kind of explain how that works and what that means for these particular characters. So the game worlds themselves are what I'd call post-apocalyptic pastorals. They're like these beautiful sprawling landscapes that you really just want to like hike and roam around, but also juxtaposed against this ruined wreckage of human civilization. And this puts us in conversation with Alenda Chang, by the way, which I just always want to shout out. Her book, Playing Nature, which I put on the top right of this slide, is just fantastic if you like thinking about ecology and video games. If you kind of like thinking about like the naturalistic environments that you roam around when you're playing a AAA game or when you're playing a big open world sort of game. Let me just look at your question. Yes, and that about The Last of Us 2. Partly about life finding its feet again. Ooh, that's interesting. I want to hear what you mean about that. Life finding its feet again. I really like that. Okay, fair enough. Cool. So do a whole bunch of talking in this chapter as well about these wanderers as kind of cursed wanderers, that eternal life is not actually all it's cracked up to be. For mythological figures, eternal life and eternal wandering is actually more often a curse than a blessing. So these are characters in that tradition. They have this kind of cursed immortality that they can't escape, even if they might like to. Sam Porter Bridges is this post-death person who, even if he dies, he just goes into the seam and basically just keeps working. He has no ability to avoid any of his work at any moment. So he's just constantly traveling these packages back and forth, trying to kind of knit this broken post-apocalyptic America back together through delivering these packages. And he'll never really get there. He can't really ever manage to get there, but, he also can't stop. And even after you finish the 60-odd hours of gameplay of him trying to reconnect everything, the game still continues. And you can still, you still have to continue wandering. So all of which is to say, I was working on this book, and it was due, the full draft of it was due to the press by the end of 2020, which was a pretty disturbing time to be kind of like working on trying to finish anything. CJ, how do we access the in-room chats? I think you go over, if you just click on the left section, there's like two chat bubbles. Are you seeing that? Well, you must be. You typed in there. Okay. If you ask me a more specific question, I can try and answer it better. Okay, so working on wandering, thinking about death in all of these wandering games and how death is so like present but also absent. You're sort of constantly enmeshed in a discourse of death, but you can't. You also don't die in these sort of games. So also, it was 2020, and I was coming up with a new semester to teach in the spring. And I had a little flexibility, which is not always the case. And I thought, okay, I want to talk about death. A couple of reasons for this. One, I have this whole theoretical interest in it, and there's a lot of really interesting work being done in it. I'll get to the second half of the syllabus, and I'll kind of go through the weeks in a minute. But first of all, my rationale for it, talk about death being everywhere and nowhere, right? I mean, there's been this very unreal quality to this year, and there's been a lot of talk about kind of giving yourself space and letting yourself breathe. But then there's a real tension between that and the fact that life has kept moving on in a whole lot of ways that are pretty uncomfortable. Everything is supposedly stopped, and we're all supposedly at home taking care of ourselves, but actually, really everyone I know has continued working harder than before, either as students, as teachers, as whatever anyone does. So there is no sort of systemic space or time for mourning and trauma and reflection on any of this massive event that all of us have been going through. So, you know, as a teacher this year, I have been very much at cross purposes, which has also been the case for friends I've talked to who have also been, you know, in this situation. There's this obligation to provide education, obviously, which means a certain rigor. And I don't mean like, you know, you have to read a book a night. I mean, learning takes effort. So as a teacher, you are implicitly and explicitly asking people to exert effort in order to engage with you.
Okay, cool.
You're asking people to do this effort, even though on a human level, it starts to seem really cruel to expect and anticipate that effort. And your university certainly needs, or it is not encouraging you to kind of lay off in the way that on a human level feels like it would be most appropriate. So caught between these pressures, I kind of wanted to teach this class both to work through this material and also to give this formalized way to think about death from all directions and kind of mourn sideways. You know, by talking about death all semester and by playing all of these different games that treat death and mourning and afterlife and work in these complicated and very different kind of sideways, I thought this could kind of be a sideways way to have the conversation. You know, some of it worked better. some weeks worked better than others. So let's see, I'm going to hop around between slides a little bit, just as I quickly go through the syllabus, and I'm super happy to talk about any of these weeks or these authors more, as anyone likes. We started with Amanda Phillips, who is absolutely the person to talk about first when we talk about death and games. Ben Drowned. Yeah, sweet. Thank you for the recti. So Amanda Phillips' concept of necropolitics is about how games make death fun, how the simulation of death as both a technological feat and gamic goal produces a playground of mortality. New orientations towards death and dying might be invented, rehearsed, and even normalized. Necropolitics is a word that comes from Mbembe's necropolitics plus game mechanics. So Mbembe reads politics as the work of death and sees sovereignty expressed predominantly as the right to kill. So Mbembe is a political theorist, but when you import that idea into the realm of games, you can see that there are similar questions that the mechanics of a particular game or a particular genre have you ask as well. So who gets to kill, who gets to die, how do we rehearse and produce this playground of mortality? You know, we already talked a little bit about the necropolitics of, for instance, walking sims, where on the one hand, there's death all around, and on the other hand, there's no death allowed in any way. all game genres have a macropolitics, and that we learn implicitly through playing them, even if we don't know exactly what they are. The other aspect of macropolitics, a related one, is that they make death fun. Macropolitics makes death fun, not merely as a visual spectacle, but as a cooperative activity performed with a machine. You're kind of working with the game, and you get that little jolt of happiness when you accomplish the task that the game told you was important to do. And so these systemic relationships influence how we think and behave within real death worlds. Highly recommend this Phillips article to anyone who's more interested, because they then go into a whole discourse on the headshot and ragdoll physics, and how the romanticization of the headshot in games and film has led to a real cultural heroizing of the headshot in real life. So whereas the headshot was never actually the most practical way to kill anyone or anything, because the head is such a small target, because of the cultural phenomenon of the headshot that began with the JFK assassination, we now have this idea of the headshot as the way to kill. And we just see that replicated in game after game after game. At which point, we now it would be strange, not to think of the headshot as the real, as the way to kill. So talked about macropolitics, a great Carly Kucerik article, and we played, I'll come back to 10 Candles when I talk about TTRPGs, but we played Hades, which has an interesting macropolitics and an even more interesting understanding of permadeath. Permadeath is typically discussed in the context of roguelikes and roguelites. They emphasize the precariousness of play by making defeat, failure, and death irrevocable. Permadeath basically means that when you play, if you die, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Your progress isn't saved. So in roguelikes, you probably know this, but just in case you don't, in roguelikes, you often have a procedurally generated world. So there's a different world each time. And every time you play, you get to a certain point, and then you might die, and then all of that progress gets lost. So there's a kind of a more visceral metaphor for death in a permadeath game. Whereas in another game, you live, and when you die, maybe you only lose a couple minutes. In a permadeath game, you can lose an entire several hours or days or months worth of work. I'm seeing these questions, but I can't quite focus on them, so I promise I will when I can. Thank you for putting them in there. Whenever I talk about permadeath, shout out to this Zach Gage, this very creepy, very wonderful Zach Gage game from 2007 called Lose Lose, which results in files on your hard drive being deleted. You play a Galaga-like game, and every time you shoot one of the alien invaders, a random file on your own computer gets deleted. So again, another way to kind of make manifest like the meaning of death. What can a game do to make you really feel it? Really feel sort of the pain of losing, the pain of death. If you can't feel it for an alien, maybe you'll feel it for the files on your own computer. It's kind of the lose-lose idea. So permadeath, playing around with what it means to, so we now know that in games, death is really nothing more than an opportunity to, get a drink, get a snack, restart. Permadeath games kind of try to make death more real again. So Hades is interesting because it's both a permadeath game and a perma-life game. Okay. You play starting in the underworld, and you're trying to get up to Mount Olympus. You're just trying to get up to the surface first, and you're trying to kind of fight your way out. It's procedurally generated, but it does have meta progression. So every time you die, you go back to the beginning, but you do have some qualities that you can keep. So you're both playing a permadeath game, but you're also permanently alive. You can't die in a way that is meaningful because you always start in the realm of the dead. And even after the it's another one of those games where after the narrative ends, you get to keep playing if you want to. I will not spoil Hades, no matter how much I might want to. But there's interesting stuff about the end game there too. So then we kind of transitioned from Hades into thinking about games and prayer and taking the religiosity of games more seriously. Campbell and Grieve have this great book that they edited, and the introduction of it is called Playing with Religion in Digital Games. So we had this cool week thinking about how you pray in Hades, which is the way you pray in most games. You it's propitiatory prayer, which means it's contractual. You ask for something, the gods give you a boon, you appreciate it, you use that boon effectively. It's a very utilitarian way of thinking about prayer. Whereas in a game like That Dragon Cancer, which, if you're not familiar with it, has to do with a 5-year-old child dying of brain cancer, and the game was later made by the child's parents as part of a mourning process, and also for other reasons. But it certainly treats prayer very differently, and it has a lot of really overt prayer that is uncomfortable, or rather is not typically what you find in a genre where prayer is more often propitiatory. From prayer, we then talked about Haunting and Doki Doki, another game I will not spoil, but that is also fantastic and very haunted, and talked about the haunted cartridge, which is a concept of the game cartridge being filled with the ghosts of previous players in some capacity. There was a famous creepypasta called Bend Round, and so we talked about Doki Doki as a kind of a haunted cartridge, because it has that sort of haunted feel to it. Then we transitioned towards, did a week on torturing. Great work from Megan Blythe Adams on exquisite corpses and the torturing of female bodies in games, especially focused on Lara Croft, but certainly also relevant in Doki Doki. And, oh, I thought we had the full hour. Does anyone know when this is over? Oh. Thanks, Kara.
Yes, you have the full hour. You go till 10. Absolutely. Keep going. You're great.
Where you are trying to figure out what happened to all of the corpses that have appeared on this ghost ship, again with an interesting necropolitics. You are kind of at work, and everyone else is living their lives or actually has already died. And you're kind of in this detective role trying to figure out what happened to all of these corpses that have appeared all over the ship. In a much more kind of utilitarian way, here are some nice pics. You Shouldn't Have Drowned on Uncanny Haunted Cartridges, That Dragon Cancer. This really lovely Gabby D'Arienzo game that you might be familiar with on being a mortician. So the practicality of preparing a body for burial is the mechanic of this game. You work with an embalming machine. You have to, this is a screenshot from the game. You have to evenly distribute chemicals and massage them through the body, and you're kind of learning how to do the work of a mortician to play the game. So very unlike a typical game world where sometimes when you shoot bodies in a AAA game, sometimes the bodies actually just disappear. They go up in this puff of smoke. This is the polar opposite of that, where you have not killed these bodies, but you are literally responsible for shrouding them and staging the funeral. So from there, we got into a 2-week section on apocalypse and post-apocalypse, and how switching perspectives around made it switching perspectives around from corpses to sort of the death of people to the death of worlds changes things as well. And then we played Spiritfarer for a week, which was a really lovely way to end the semester. So I did want to talk about doomed and unwinnable tabletop RPGs, which I will, I think, end with. But before I get there, I wanted a quick aside on Zoom and how weird it's been to be spending all this time talking about death to basically like this sort of blank screen classroom. I don't know what your experiences have been with Zoom this year or with digital meetings, digital classes, whatever you've been doing digitally. But there's certainly been this very strange sense that like the Zoom has served as this afterlife sort of space. Students don't typically turn on their cameras, and my policy is not to ask anyone to for various reasons that all make a lot of sense, but result in this phenomenon where you are often sort of trying to talk into this very evocative metaphor of a void, right? This sort of like universe that, oh, people are turning on their cameras. No, it's really okay. You don't have to turn on your camera. I'm really used to it. Yeah, thank you, Ellen. It's exactly what I'm doing now. It's, trying to give Zoom classes has felt really evocatively like just shouting into a void. And some days it's like you're just giving a stand-up routine that is constantly bombing because there's like no feedback at all. And so you just kind of get used to that. And you're like, yeah, okay, I'm going to go give a bombing stand-up routine. Like, that's cool. And it is. Like, it does. You kind of get used to it. But certainly in teaching this class, it took on this haunted valence. It was like, I am speaking into this void of people who are all post something. All of us are sitting in this very like post moment, especially when I designed the class. It was October. We hadn't heard anything about vaccines. There was definitely a way in which it felt like, no, we're not coming back to anything. We're not in between anything. We're just after. So trying to teach this in the spring was like, okay, what are we after? What are we in between? It's this whole like group of like very like burned out shells of people who are all like coming together to try to think about death, and who are all after something. Felt like the afterlife to me, or felt like some afterlife. It had an afterlife valence to me for sure. So unsurprisingly, I spent some time thinking about doomed and unwinnable tabletop games. And seeing as this is one of my favorite things about FIG the last time I went, I wanted to end with a couple of my favorite doomed and unwinnable tabletop games, which you may or may not be familiar with. I highly recommend them all. I found all of these really cool and really provocative. What I mean by doomed and unwinnable is that, well, for example, 10 Candles is a storytelling game of tragic horror by Stephen Dewey. And as he says, it's a tragic horror rather than survival horror. A hope that you might beat the odds and win does not exist in this game. It is not a game you can win. It is not about whether the characters fall to the darkness or emerge as survivors. There are no survivors. So this tragic horror, and then due to the events of the game, characters put out their candles one by one until when the last candle goes out, all of the characters in the game die. It's an alien invasion game. So they have appeared and darkness has fallen on the earth. And there's this ragtag band of survivors telling the story of their last couple hours. So lovely mechanics, very creepy, very beautiful, very unpleasant if you're not kind of on board with the idea that the world will end and the game will die. Similarly, a fascinating game about imperialism called Dog Eat Dog by Liam Lewenag Burke, which is not as available anymore to buy, but if you can get your hands on a copy of it, or if you want to reach out to me and I can try and help you, highly recommended as well. It plays around with the mechanics of imperialism. There, one character, one person, one player plays as the occupation, and everyone else plays as native people. And you come up with certain rules and you create a record. But the one unassailable rule of the record is the native people are inferior to the occupation people. And so as the mechanics play out and everything has to keep referring to the record, that gets baked into the story, such that it's very, very difficult for the occupation not to win the game. Every time I've played this game, the occupation has won. If you've ever played this game and had the native people win, please tell me how you did it, because I would love to be able to have a victorious ending of this game. But for the most part, the game ends when, so this is describing the way the death mechanic works. Basically, when a native character loses all of their tokens, they commit some sort of very violent act, very violent rupture sort of an act, and then their character dies. And this is in the bottom right corner is the aftermath. And it describes what happens in the end game depending on how many tokens you have. All of which are pretty bleak. And in that bleakness, I think does a pretty good job of evoking a sense of desperation and reality that more victorious and traditional games you can win oftentimes don't. One of my favorites is Dialect, Thorny Games, in which you create a dialect out of a bunch of words based on certain, so you make up all of these words based on the values of your particular small community, and you sort of tell this whole story about how that community forms and what matters to them. And then you role play using those words. And so 5 hours in, you and all of your friends are using, like you're using these words as if they were dictionary words. But each game comes with a core conceit. The isolation will end. It is a game about dialects dying out. And it has a very explicit political balance to it. You know, it's supposed to make you fall in love with your dialect and then have it narratively disappear. So, you know, and every time you play this game, you come up with all these amazing words and you're really into them and you promise your friends that you're going to use them in your discourse going forward. Like, these are just going to become words that we use, and it never happens because without the structure of the game, you move on, you do other things, and that's also the point of the game. And then the final example of a Doom tabletop is the Skeletons, which I have right here, but I was too lazy to take more pictures of than just the cover. It's a game in which by Jason Morningstar, so great. And it's a game in which you play as the skeletons in a dungeon crawler. So the heroes come in and you respond to the heroes in various ways. And it also inevitably ends with the desecration of your home. There's an alternate ending where you can just decide to like leave it undesecrated. But I think that's just, I have not ever had someone who sort of plays it that way. This is probably my next project. I'm really into doomed games and how or whether they are fun. Pretty interested in like this TTRPG mechanic that I feel like is becoming even more prevalent. It's, obviously existed before. So opening up the floor now. Happy to take any questions or thoughts. I'll also look in the chat and see what people have been saying. I also just put up some questions that we talked about in the class all semester in case you just wanted fodder to like talk about things. just in case any of that strikes a chord. And thank you again for coming. Really appreciate you being here with me on this virtual Saturday morning. Yay. I will look in the chat. Oh, Ellen, go ahead.
Hi. First of all, I really enjoyed your talk, and I was particularly fascinated by the parallel that you drew to your studies with COVID-19. And I'm wondering if you're aware of a ludic experience that challenges you to live through something like that, where you don't have time to mourn, and suddenly you have time to mourn. Because for example, there are a lot of AA and AAA titles that involve like massive violence and murder, and then at some point in the game, there is a sort of reckoning of dealing with the trauma of that. There's some sort of catharsis. Did I lose you?
Hey, you still there?
Yes. Hello?
I just lost you for a second. I'm sorry. You were about connections with, and there are a lot of AAA games, and then I lost.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
There are a lot of AAA games where you'll have, as part of the narrative, there's a lot of violence and death and murder, and then there is a scene in which the main character has this sort of catharsis of like, oh my God, I'm now experiencing everything that has just happened. And I'm wondering if you see that parallel that you drew of COVID, of this idea of you don't have time to mourn, you just have to keep moving on, but you have to appreciate the reality of it, if you're familiar with that in a game's experience.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Great question. And so a couple thoughts. One, there's a, oh, sorry, I'm not sure where that noise is coming from. Okay, so a couple thoughts. One, not really, not yet. I expect them to be coming. I think so far, the main phenomenon we've seen this year has been cozy games and the digital hearth idea that everyone's sort of been comforting themselves around some sort of a digital hearth. And then also been forced to be kind of on screens constantly. So there's this push and pull of different kinds of digital hearts. In terms of catharsis, kind of just pushing through and having to keep going and keep moving on.
Right?
There's...
Yep, so you are in the blue room.
I'm reminded of this, Agamben's Bare Life talks about this a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
The modern world in general doesn't give us time for mourning or grief.
Don't worry if you're starting a couple minutes late. That's pretty typical.
There's no anything other than just kind of continuing to go.
Use the screen share function to share any slides you've got.
I don't see that happening yet in games. A moment where it's kind of giving us the space.
And your centered console, exactly.
The closest that I can think of, and this obviously doesn't have to do with COVID-19 because the game came out before then, but Heaven's Vault does an amazing job at evoking the concept of slow violence, which I see as very related to the experience of COVID-19 in this last year. So slow violence is a concept from Rob Nixon. It's a really good book, and it's about how just because violence is happening slowly doesn't mean it's not happening. We have this bias towards violence as a speedy thing, a bullet from a gun. But the slow melting of a glacier and the erasure of an island nation because of it is violence. It might just be happening over 100 years. So a game like Heaven's Vault does a really good job at showing these tiny incremental kinds of these tiny incremental incidents that happen that result in an incredibly violent, like big denouement, but you don't necessarily see it coming because all you see are the little slow bits that happen. So there's an article by Megan Condis that's on this idea, and that is what I hope to see in games that start dealing with the pandemic coming out in the next year or two. An exploration of slow violence and all of the ways that slow violence kind of harmed us this year. Thank you. Good question. Cozy Grove exists at the intersection of Mourning and Nice. Oh, B, that's a great idea. Yeah, let me, B said other things, other people said things in the chat, so give me 1 second. Yeah, B, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I guess what I wanted to loop back around to is Last of Us Part 2 sort of happens after, like, I don't know, a lot of the global trauma has kind of wrapped up and society is sort of re-stabilizing, kind of the way Walking Dead does. So I guess I'm curious if that, how you read that for Ellie and Abby to sort of have to be these like very hardened killer types in a world that is starting not to need them anymore.
Yeah, awesome question. Thank you. And thank you for all your questions during the talk, which I will go back and look at.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah. So I also love that question because I have a great answer for it, which is the last chapter of my book, which I think is my favorite, which is that I read The Last of Us Part 2 and Death Stranding both as actually games about pilgrimage. They're not games about killing. They're games about being after death and trying to walk your way back to some sort of grace. So I think for Ellie and I mean, I think both of them, the pilgrimage succeeds for Ellie more painfully than for Abby. Abby kind of gets it earlier. She doesn't have to walk as far. She doesn't have as much trauma to undo, honestly. But for Ellie, the moment where I see it really turn into more of a pilgrimage than anything else is when she's back at the farm. She's accomplished what she wanted to accomplish, supposedly. You know, she's made her choices, and then she can't just keep going. She hasn't extirpated the grief in some meaningful way. She needs to get back on her feet and keep mourning, which is one of the origins of pilgrimage. I mean, there are a lot of reasons for pilgrimage and a lot of kinds of faith. But I think the kind of needing to walk into the grief was really my experience of that game.
I figured
the
out how to
killing
record
was
everything just using
the
Google
gloss,
Meet,
the kind of bright, shiny thing that let you feel as if you were playing like a really violent game when what you were actually doing was like trying to walk it off. So
pretty happy.
That's my answer to that. That yes, the world is kind of demanding less uber violence from Ellie and Abby, but
so they know I'm
in the wake of that, what comes? A need to reckon with the parts of yourself that you have numbed in doing all of that violence. The parts of yourself that have been so badly traumatized. How do you do that? Walking in, my room.
Whoa.
When is the book coming out? Great question. So MIT just delayed it, but it'll be mid-2022. And it will be available digitally because I negotiated it. Yeah, so it should be available digitally. And
that's my partner, Elise.
You stay in touch with me in any way, LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. I'll be announcing it all over the place. Thank you for being interested. But yeah, it'll be up.
And I love doing this. It's really fun. I'm actually super glad that it's raining like crazy this weekend because it would have been a bummer if it was a really nice weekend.
CJ, you have a question up here. Will the slides be available?
How about you? What are you doing?
Yes. This is reminding me to redo my website. I'm actually not sure what BostonFIG is planning to do with all the slides. I think the talks are being recorded, but I'll check with them. And if not, I'll put them up on my site.
Absolutely. I hear you. That makes sense.
Here's your thoughts on the Kubler-Ross model and how players understand diet and killing. Can you explain that a little bit more? I don't know what you're talking about with
collection of otters. Romps.
There's so much circling around the Q&A spot. Or you can put it in the chat or whatever. That's cool too.
Chat's gonna be easier.
Oh, I can hear something.
Isn't it
CJ,
awesome? I
hey.
love the
Oh, wait,
like
hello.
actual
Check
one, two,
conference,
check one,
like
two.
you can
Yay,
bump
I can hear
people
you.
how to
Great.
feel, you
I
know?
don't. Sorry, I'm still learning how all this works. It's my first virtual fig.
Fair.
So the Kubler-Ross is the model of grief that has anger, negotiating, bargaining.
Sure.
I can't remember. Acceptance.
Acceptance,
There's
yeah.
generally 5. And I know there's a lot of questions or controversy about how applicable it is.
Yeah,
Whether people move them all the same way, but it
We did both of
suggests
our
there's
birthday
sort
parties
of
and gathered.
an emotional
Elise had a little
spectrum
costume party
or
birthday, and I had a
journey that a lot of experiences don't necessarily ask you to engage in when you're playing them, and they're focused on either hyperviolence or processing.
Sorry, I have like several windows
Yeah.
going, so I'm hearing audio from like other places too.
So I was just curious to get your
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question, and it is even the games that aren't focused on hyperviolence and that are more focused on the aftermath of things are more about narratively interesting stuff, like tying the story of a person's life together into like a nice, neat way, or it's not like here, let me allow the character or the player to process their grief about this. Anger is really the main emotion or the main affect that you oftentimes are allowed to have. I'm thinking about Aubrey Annabelle's playing with affect too. I feel like that like affect studies is really needs to be brought in here.
And it's a lovely company to work at.
I think
so I've been doing that full time.
The games that I'm highlighting at the very end, these like Doom and Unwinnable tabletop games, I think they're trying to get at something like that. They're trying to get at something other than anger, but it seems like the main emotion the main affect that they do get at is hopelessness. I mean, you have to go through the stages of grief in order to enjoy playing the game, but you can just as easily not go through the stages and be super frustrated and be like, well, why did I come up with this whole character or do this whole language? So I think if you let those games take you where they want you to go, you could go through that process. You won't necessarily. You might,
which is
or maybe it's so heavy-handed that you don't really feel an authentic sense of those emotions. I mean, how do you evoke grief?
Awesome. Let's see. Sarah just messaged.
Grief is apparent.
Yeah. Over to Sarah.
A good question. Let me think about it more.
What's going on? Hold on. I'll be right back.
Any other questions?
Just in here. Walk up to Sarah.
Stages of grief. Thank you, Robert Henley. I'll just zoom it up back through the chat, see if I didn't get anything.
All right. So for your panel,
students won't turn on the cameras. Also, students, why didn't you turn on the cameras?
Stage.
Yeah.
A nice little set of a little cabin
please.
Stage.
Hi.
Where are you getting these questions from? Are they from the nearby chat in Gather or somewhere else?
No problem.
Oh, yes, they are in the Gather chat function.
Oh, okay, cool.
Just over here on the left.
No problem.
Thank you.
No problem.
Sure.
Gather is shockingly intuitive.
Yeah, the cameras issue. It's been a big deal all year. Cool.
Yeah,
cool.
If you're just co-working with people, then
thoughts?
Gather supports up to 25 people for free. So yeah, it's really, really cool.
Yeah, I just wanted to, so I think I dropped a link, but just to make sure you see it, I think one of my favorite doomed TTRPGs is Misspent Youth,
back to my little
which is the punk rock version of that, basically. You either sell out or you die.
We got about 3 minutes until that.
Interesting.
It's a lot, yeah.
Usually people start a couple minutes late.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that these sort of
few minutes late for everything
unwinnable games are doing like useful affect?
I don't know. Here, I'll turn off my camera. Maybe that'll help me catch up. Okay. I had a freeze on my end.
Yeah, I did
you hear
too.
me? Okay. So I think the question of whether or not they're doing a good job, I think, yeah, absolutely. I've played a bunch of games where I've slaughtered everything in my path, like Red, right? Like, I think part of it is we just need to move away from the idea of like, I think a lot of people still think of games the way we think of, painting being like, oh, you paint a house, like that's a useful thing, right? And that makes the house more pleasant. And it's like, well, okay, but then you also have, fine art, right? And I think that's something like just on a very like sort of nuts and bolts thing of like how we frame what a game is. And, I think that I've talked with my students a lot about games like Fire Emblem, right? Which have permadeath for characters and you move on. So you as a player experience that death. Or can I always just restart? But then like there are no mechanics for mourning, right? Like the only difference is you miss out on those conversations, you miss out on those side quests, whatever. Like the absence has no presence.
Okay, that was just a very beautiful line, and we're going to end on that. Thank you so much. I thank you for everyone who came. I would love to keep this conversation going. Please reach out to me on Twitter, over email, whatever. I've got my information up there. LinkedIn. I'm not on Facebook, but that's fine. Thank you so much. Really fun time. Enjoy the rest of Virtual Fig. And I'll talk to you later. Oh, thanks for the heart. Bye.